Hello, time for another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is Fire, a very short introduction by Andrew C. Scott. This book was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. It's 152 pages. This book is part of the Oxford University Press very short introduction series. As the name implies, these are short books, usually around 150 pages, written by scholars on various nonfiction topics. Most of the books are intended for students who are studying various topics, but they're written in non-technical language so that just everyday people can read them if you happen to be interested in a particular topic. It's a very successful series. There's over 400 titles. Last time I checked, there's over 400 titles in the series, so it's one of the longest-running book series in the world. This particular book is divided into, I think, 6 chapters, each one dealing with a different aspect of fire. The first chapter deals with the chemical and physical nature of fire, the elements of fire, of which there are basically three major elements. One is fuel, another one is oxygen, and the third is an ignition source. You can't have a fire without having all three of those. Conversely, if you eliminate one of those three, you put out fires. All fires are suppressed by blocking one of the three parts of the fire trifecta. For example, wildland fires are usually fought by bulldozing trees and shrubs in a perimeter around the fire, removing the fuel source. This is known as a fire break. So when the fire reaches the fire break, there's no longer any fuel and the fire dies out. The ignition source is what the water is used for. When water is sprayed onto a fire, the water absorbs the heat and lowers the temperature of the fire down below its ignition point, causing the fire to go out. Removing oxygen is what is done when you throw sand on a fire or throw a fire blanket over a kitchen fire, something like that. By cutting off the oxygen supply, the fire goes out. So those three elements are the basic elements of fire. The fire environment also has three elements to it. Those are, once again, fuel, also weather, and the topography of the land around the fire. The more trees, the more underbrush, the more grass you have, the more likely are you going to have a fire. The higher the temperature and the lower the humidity, the more likely a fire will occur and the faster it'll spread. And the topography is the shape of the landscape. It turns out that fires burn much more rapidly on slopes or hillsides than they do on flat land. And so those all have to be taken into account when dealing with fire. The second chapter deals with the history of fire, and it talks about how scientists have used things like tree rings and analysis of fossilized charcoal to try to determine how fire evolved as the earth developed. And what we learned is that plants, of course, have a huge role in how common fires were in prehistoric ancient times. For example, during the Cretaceous period, the last era of the dinosaurs, that was a high fire period, because of the evolution of seed plants, angiosperms, these are seed-bearing plants. That's when these plants first evolved during the Cretaceous period, and seed-bearing plants grew very rapidly during this period and released huge amounts of oxygen into the air. And the more oxygen you have in the atmosphere, the more likely fires are to occur. So there were a lot of fires occurring during the Cretaceous period. During earlier periods where there weren't nearly as many plants, the amounts of fire was much less because there was less oxygen in the air. Again, there's another three-pronged element to the history of fire. This is plant evolution, atmospheric change, and climate change. All of these over time has affected how common fires have been in prehistoric and ancient times up to today. The third chapter is on how humans have impacted fire, and it talks about how humans early on discovered that fire could be used in agriculture. One of the very earliest agricultural techniques is slash and burn agriculture, where you cut down trees and shrubs and burn them. And then the ash is used as fertilizer for their crops. And this was done by nomadic tribes people who would go into an area, burn out the area, plant, and then move on to another area afterwards. Also, very early on, humans discovered that fire could be used as a weapon, burning cities that had been captured. Was a way to terrorize other cities into surrendering without having to fight. And the ancient Greeks developed a chemical that they was known as Greek fire that they used to burn warships with, and going all the way up to modern times with incendiary bombs and so forth. Fire has been a major aspect of warfare. Um, about the late 19th century and the early 20th century is when attitudes toward wildland fires changed. Indigenous tribes people knew early on that fire was a natural part of the biosphere they were living in. In fact, sometimes various Indian tribes in North America would deliberately start fires to clear out the grassland and replenish the soil so that there would be more grass for the buffalo and so forth. But in the late 19th century, early 20th century, attitude began that fires were always bad. Wildland fires were bad. This was epitomized by the U.S. Forest Service Smokey the Bear ad campaign, where the slogan was, "Only you can prevent forest fires." The implication being that fires were always bad, forest fires were always bad. And this led to widespread suppression of forest fires throughout the 20th century. But this had an unexpected effect because the suppression of fire meant that the fuel load in various areas became very large. There was a lot of unburned dead trees, a lot of grass and dead grasses and stuff building up. And so that when fires did break out, they were much more severe than they had been in the past. Um, that leads to the fourth chapter, which is about fire suppression and the consequences of putting out fires when the natural tendency is for fires to occur. Uh, in fact, some trees cannot reproduce without fire. There are some coniferous trees, evergreen trees, that will not release their seeds from their cones unless they're scorched by fire. This causes the cones to open up and release the seeds. So, if you suppress the fire, you're altering the biosphere and the whole evolutionary development of these, or the progression of these plants. There's also a section on the different kinds of fire extinguishers. A lot of people think there's only one type, but there's actually 5 major types of fire extinguishers that are labeled A through E. A fire extinguishers are the ones that are used to put out wood and paper fires. B fire extinguishers are used to put out oil and grease fires. C is for flammable gases like propane and butane. D extinguishers are used to put out flammable metals like lithium, which is often found in rechargeable batteries. And then E are electrical fire extinguishers. And many fire extinguishers combine several of these. You can have A, B, C fires extinguishers, or A, B, E fires and extinguishers, and so forth. The 5th chapter deals with new technologies dealing with fire. One of the great breakthroughs occurred in the late 20th century with the use of satellite technology. Fire detecting satellites have allowed humans to spot fires much more in isolated areas like Alaska or Russian tundra much sooner than they would have been found otherwise. And the use of computers have, much like computer modeling has revolutionized weather forecasting, it's also revolutionized fire prediction. By putting in models, you can predict how severe a fire season will be, which parts of an area will be more affected by fire, and therefore you can make some efforts to try to counteract the dangers of fires from these computer models. Now, one of the discoveries that this technology has led us to is to realize the importance of fire on the effect of soils. It turns out that when you have a particularly severe fire, the heat goes down into the soil and affects the roots of plants. Long after the fire may have been put out, the roots may still be very hot, and this affects the future growth of the plants. And also, this can also affect the soil composition. For example, in Portugal, following World War II, there was an effort to plant large numbers of eucalyptus trees for agriculture. But when you burn eucalyptus trees, they release an oily substance into the soil, which creates a waterproof layer or water-resistant layer. And when fires broke out in Portugal in the late 20th century, they were extremely uh, intense because this oily substance was flammable and spread the fire across the ground. And also, when when it rained, the water ran off, and this created mudslides and great soil erosion. We've also seen this in California with the sagebrush in California has a similar effect. A lot of times after a very bad fire season in California, when the rains come in the fall, there's huge mudslides in some of these hilly areas because this oily substance from the sagebrush gets into the soil and causes the water to run off instead of being absorbed into the soil. The chapter also talks about modern attempts at fire suppression and prevention. One of the things it talks about is one of the increasing problems is when people move into high fire zones and build houses there. In situations like that, when you have a lot of houses in basically an urban area moving into a forested area, you're at high risk, of course, for fires there. And you can't let the fires burn out naturally because there's too many people living there and too many expensive houses, and so you have to suppress the fire. So it talks about some of the ways you can prevent damage to these houses. One way is to clear out an area around the house. Clear out all the trees and shrubbery, doing things as simple as going up on the roof and sweeping off dead leaves and pine needles from the roof and using roofing materials that are fire resistant, removing dead trees or dead plants from gardens at the end of a gardening season, plowing them under, not leaving them out there, and avoiding anything flammable coming near houses. And also making sure that there's multiple evacuation routes. It mentions the 2018 fire at Paradise, California, a small town which the fire killed 85 people. It turns out one of the reasons this fire was so deadly is that they had a lot of houses that were wood framed that were surrounded by trees. And there were only a handful of routes out of the town. And so when people tried to evacuate, there was these big traffic jams and many people were caught and couldn't get out in time. So this kind of planning ahead of time will limit the dangers and the death tolls from fires from people living in these high fire areas. The final chapter is on the effect of climate change. And of course, this has been very controversial. There's many people that are climate change doubters. And there's other people that go the other extreme and blame climate change for everything. Climate change is very complicated in its relationship to fires. As the atmosphere heats up, more water can be absorbed into the atmosphere, which means that some places get more rainfall, which in some ways can suppress the fires. But more rainfall also leads to more grasses and shrubs building up, which increases the fuel load so that when there is a dry period, you may have more fires. And we've seen that recently in California, where there were 2 years of unusually heavy rains followed by a drought, and this led to a huge buildup of fuel, which led to very severe fires. Also, other areas, climate change can cause droughts, which, of course, initially makes it a high fire area, but then after the areas burn out, because there's a drought, there's fewer plants growing after the fire, and so that reduces the chances of fire. As deserts increase, as desertification increases, grasslands turn into desert areas, that actually reduces the amount of fire in some areas because, of course, deserts don't have the fuel load that grasslands have. At the end of the book, there's a list of books for further reading, an extensive list of other books if you want to continue learning more about fire, the science of fire, and the future of fire, and fire suppression, and so forth. So as you can tell from this brief summary, that even though this book is quite short, at just about 150 pages, it's very thorough and covers many aspects of fire. So if you're interested in the topic of fire, this is an excellent book to read. It's written in a very accessible style. There's a number of illustrations as well, and again, resources to read further. The book is Fire, a very short introduction. The author is Andrew C. Scott. This has been another Man in Gray Book Review. Thanks for watching.